It's time for the Phil Ferguson Show.
This is Phil Ferguson, and you are listening to the cleverly titled The Phil Ferguson Show. I am so delighted to have you, and it's a really weird thing. This show is going out only 6 days after my previous show. It turned out that I was scrambling for people to talk to at the last minute, and then several of them came through, so I have a couple of interviews already in the can for the next few weeks, and we'll be getting to those. I do not expect to put out a show between Christmas and New Year's because I found out from the past 5 or 6 years of doing this, no one fucking listens to them anyway because you've got other shit to do. So take a break. Enjoy your vacation. Take a break from me. Not too long of a break because come back. We'll have more good stuff, of course, in the new year. But in this episode, we have an interview with one of the co-authors of a book called Darwin's Apostles. So we're going to talk about Charles Darwin, how his theory came up, and how it was defended and argued for. Absolutely fantastic conversation. You're going to love it. The formal investing skeptically segment is called Dollar Cost Ravaging, and I think it's something you might see a lot of in the coming years. People using it to scare you out of stock investing and buying annuities. And I'm going to go through the mathematics. So for those who really like when I kind of get a little into the math of how investments work, you might like this episode more than some of the others. And then the other thing I just kind of have to throw in because it is time sensitive here just in time for Christmas is this case where the Mormon Church apparently has hidden away, and now we all know about it, $100 billion. The Mormon Church does not pay taxes like any church, and it's sitting on a stockpile of $100 billion that we know of, and that's with one investment company. Maybe in the new year we'll find there's even more companies out there that are tied to the Mormon church, and there's even more money sitting around. They just keep growing the pot bigger and bigger and bigger, and they should not be a tax-free organization. And matter of fact, for churches in general, my position is that they can keep their tax-free status as long as they comply with all of the 501c3 regulations, which means they have to publish documents on where the money comes from and where it goes. Churches are a great big black hole of money and create the opportunity for people who are morally challenged to do the right thing, and they can get away with a ton of money and not pay taxes on it and move it to different countries. They can help elect politicians, which they're not supposed to be allowed to do, and all that shit needs to stop. So that's the first step. Now, whether they should pay taxes in general, maybe we should have some kind of rule that if they can't give 10 or 15 or 20% of their money to charity, to helping people, to actual real charity, not evangelism, but actually helping people, then maybe they lose their tax-free status. And I think that would affect the vast majority of churches based on our previous discussions of church budgets. And of course, right now we have the Trump impeachment limbo game. Trump has been formally impeached as of the recording of this on 2 counts, and it is likely to go to the Senate. There's some discussion because Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham, and if not others, have formally came out and said that not only are they partisan and won't look at the evidence, they are going to work with the alleged perp, I guess, in this case, and act on his behalf, which generally would disqualify you from being a juror or a judge if you've declared in advance the innocence or guilt of the person you're supposed to be paying attention and listening to. And it's an adventure. It is unfortunately very partisan. And I know the regular listeners won't be surprised to hear me say, I think that it's very, very, very clear that Donald Trump broke the law on many occasions, and he should not be president. I recently had someone tell me that I've always hated Donald Trump. And I said, yes, I have. But that doesn't change the fact of the matter that he broke the law. And if he was able to present evidence to show that he did not break the law, I would be willing, unlike Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham, to change my position and admit that I was wrong. I don't think I am, but I'm open to that possibility. That's the big difference. I'm willing to accept new evidence and reevaluate my position. Kind of a life goal of mine to continually do that. So we've got that coming up in the new year in 2020. And so we're going to get to our segments here, and I'll talk to you again at the end of the show.
What if you're wrong?
Well, what if I'm wrong? I mean, anybody could be wrong. We could all be wrong about the flying spaghetti monster and the pink unicorn and the flying teapot. You happen to have been brought up, I would presume, in the Christian faith. You know what it's like not to believe in a particular faith because you're not a Muslim, you're not a Hindu. Why aren't you a Hindu? Because you happen to have been brought up in America, not in India. If you'd been brought up in India, you'd be a Hindu. If you were brought up in Denmark in the time of the Vikings, you'd be believing in Wotan and Thor. If you were brought up in classical Greece, you'd be believing in Zeus. If you were brought up in Central Africa, you'd be believing in the great Juju up the mountain. I mean, there's no particular reason to pick on the Judeo-Christian God in which, by the sheerest accident, you happen to have been brought up, and ask me the question, what if I'm wrong? What if you're wrong about the great Juju at the bottom of the sea?
This Investing Skeptically segment is on a new topic called dollar cost ravaging. You may be familiar with dollar cost averaging, and we've talked about that in the past, but in this case, it's dollar cost ravaging. So they've just added an R in front of it, and it's meant to show potentially what could happen to your portfolio in retirement if you keep taking money out year after year after year. And it goes from 2000 to 2018, at the beginning of 2019. And some places have been using this data from Morningstar to talk about why you should diversify. I think that's a good thing to do, but that graph that they're using, that they're sharing, looks a little scary. I've seen other places use this as proof that the stock market doesn't work and you should buy annuities. Because, of course, the best way to sell you annuities is to scare you. And if an annuity has a guaranteed payout percentage, if there's not any other tricks or traps in the 100-page document, which there always seems to be, you could get a guaranteed payout amount. And that would be safer than what dollar cost ravaging could do to your portfolio. And maybe there's some merit in extreme cases. One of the things I hope you did recognize already as a regular listener to the show, that this starts in the year 2000. And they always take the data from the year 2000 if they're trying to scare you about the stock market, because the year 2000 follows the years where the market went up like crazy. And in our Wayback Machine, that's when we had the dot-com craze, and everybody who was anybody was investing in the stock market. Just as an example of how crazy it was, in case you're new to investing, in 1995, the market went up almost 38%. 96 was 23%. 97 was 33, 98 was 29, and 99 was 20 calendar year. These are all calendar year numbers. You can always pick and choose different dates and get different numbers, but to try to keep it simple. So let's see, 30, 50, 80. I mean, we're talking almost 200% increase in 5 years. If you're a study of history, you should know that that's not normal. To say the least. Let's see, according to Wikipedia, the 5-year average return After that fifth year was 28.56% per year. The long-term historical norm is 10. And so, again, with this regression to the mean, it would seem ever increasingly more likely that as you get to higher and ridiculous and longer running performance numbers, that maybe something will come along and change that to the negative. And boy, did it. But anyway, they always seem to start at the year 2000. So we're going to start at the year 2000. And I did the math and I checked out their numbers and it all looks right. If you start with $1 million and take out 4%, $40,000, and increase it by 3% for inflation, after 18 years, from 2000 to 2018, you would end up with $233,000, not the million that you started with. And that's a problem. There's a couple things that I do, like I said, I want to point out is, one, this started in 2000, which is the absolute worst case scenario in 100 plus years of data. So they started with the worst case scenario. The other thing is that they do increase the amount you take out every year by 3% for inflation. Most investors, most retirees, if they start pulling out $40,000 in retirement, they keep pulling out $40,000. They don't increase it by 3% every year. Someone may. Some people may take out more than that. But if you don't increase for inflation, of course, this becomes dramatically less of a problem. But let's leave it in there. Now, some people will suggest that the solution to this is to buy an annuity. And some websites have used this to kind of scare people. And some have used it just to say, hey, it's not always all about stocks. You should diversify. And I happen to agree with that. So I created my own little model, my own little Excel spreadsheet here. And I just made it really simple. I put 60% in the S&P 500 and 40% in the Vanguard Total Bond Market Index. Now, today, that is not necessarily my recommendation. This is just for discussion purposes to see what happens. But today, you might be better off in having not the Total Bond Market Index, but more short-term bonds, because the Total Bond Index does have some intermediate and long-term bonds that have done really well in the last 15, 18 years. Made a lot of money with those. But going forward, I'm more concerned about those. Another topic. Sorry. Too many things to think about. But just to make this simple, 60% stock, 40% bonds. And again, this is not a specific recommendation to anybody. We're just having a little mathematical fun. If then you look at each year and you compare what happened in the previous year, what did better, the S&P 500 or your total bond index? If stocks did better, you take money out of the stock market, you're $40,000 plus. If bonds did better, you take money out of the bond index that you have. And you do that each year. And I also added another rule, is if the stock market has a big correction, like it did in 2001, 2002, and again in 2008, you go ahead and wait 2 years for the stock market to come back before you take out from the stock market, because you want to recover those losses. As an example, in 2008, the stock market went down 37%. And so the next year we take out from bonds, and then for 2 more years we take out from bonds because we're waiting for the stock market to come back. The really interesting thing there is we also get to the calendar year 2011, where stocks only went up 2.1% and bonds went up 7.5%. So that triggers our rule again to take out from bonds and not the stock market. I'm also not doing any rebalancing because I wanted to make this math really simple for me. But in this scenario, we started off with $1 million in 2000, 60% S&P 500, not even the total stock market, but the S&P 500, and 40% in the total bond market from index, from Vanguard. And we take out according to those rules, and I keep adding inflation to the numbers taken out every year after year after year. And at the end of 2018, the total portfolio is $867,000, where the example with just stocks, just the S&P 500, your net result is $233,000. In this case, you have $867,000 $7,000, because for a few years at a time, when the stock market is down, you can sell bonds. Now, of course, all of this gets way more complicated because stocks pay dividends and bonds pay dividends. And of course, if the market's down, the first thing you're going to spend are the dividends. So you don't even have to sell 40,000 plus of stuff because part of it comes as dividends. I didn't take that into effect. I didn't take into account having a real estate fund like the Vanguard REIT index. I didn't take into account having a variety of international funds. Like I said, this is incredibly simple. I went from one investment, the S&P 500, to two investments, the S&P 500 and the Vanguard Total Bond Market Index. And the end result went from 234,000 to 867,000. And again, keep in mind, this was meant to be, I think, by the person that designed the graph, having designed many graphs for said purposes. This is a worst case scenario because you have the dot-com crash, you have the housing market crash. With both of those scenarios, and with taking out 4% and even more because of inflation, you still end up with way more money if you have two investments versus one. And so now to the question of what happens if you take out 5% per year. So I'm going to type this into this massive spreadsheet that I made. In the original scenario, you would have gone broke, run out of money around 2015. So in 15 years, your money's gone. Now, in my little bit more elaborate scenario, we have $478,000 left. Now, $478,000 versus being broke, clearly way better. Matter of fact, the other one, if we continued it on past being broke, you were $300,000 in the hole. The difference here is almost $900,000 just by having two investments to choose from. Again, keep in mind, I didn't engage in any rebalancing, which adds to your portfolio performance, and I only had two investments. For people in retirement today, I'll have 4 or 5, 6, maybe 7 different bond positions. The U.S. stock market, I break up into 6 individual components. There's the real estate fund, and then there's 2 to 5 international funds, depending on the size of your portfolio. And so you can use much more precision in deciding what to take money out of. And people who are in retirement that are clients of mine now, when they need a little more cash in their portfolio, we are taking out of something like the Vanguard Large Cap Growth Fund, which I think as of today, year to date, and this is late December, is somewhere around up 30%. So you take from the winners. So these numbers will get only better and better and better. But I thought it was interesting that even in this worst case scenario, 2000 to 2018, with only two investments, instead of being short 300,000, you're up almost, or you still have $500,000. And again, this doesn't take into account the fact that if you could reduce your amount you take out during down years, it also doesn't take into account that most people don't adjust the amount they take out every year for inflation. So that would dramatically change the numbers to the benefit. And it doesn't have that investment clarity that I like to talk about, where you have 10 or 12 different positions where you can cherry pick and choose from the biggest winner, not just for that calendar year, but if you need more money in the middle of the year, you can look at the year to date, the 1 year, the 2 year to 3 year, and you can pick from whatever's the best. And I didn't use any of that nuance here. I just made a simple rule. Did you take from stocks or did you take from bonds? So that's a little bit about dollar cost ravaging, which you may see more and more now because it's such a beautiful graph to use to scare people. So I expect for years to come, annuity salespeople will be showing this graph created by Morningstar, which is factually correct, but to show you how scary and dangerous it is to be in the S&P 500. And I will have to grant that if your entire investment is only the S&P 500, and I have people that have showed me portfolios that not only are they incredibly overweighted in the S&P 500, but they're incredibly overweighted in large cap growth stocks. And sometimes they'll have an income fund, an income stock fund, a growth and income stock fund, a growth stock fund, an aggressive growth stock fund, and they think they have 5 or 6 different stock funds. But when you look inside at what they own, they all own the same shit. And as long as the market keeps rewarding those same companies, you're okay. But if it changes, and history is full of changes in the stock market, because sometimes large caps win, sometimes, more often than not, small caps win. Sometimes growth does better, like right now. For the last 8 to 10 years, growth has beaten value by several percentage points. Historically, value actually outperforms growth. Will that return again? We don't know. Will bonds outperform stocks again? Will international outperform domestic? We don't know, and that's the point of having a broadly diversified portfolio. So them starting with this example of just the S&P 500, I think is almost comical, but I know there's people that have investments like that. So if you have only large cap stocks or only the S&P 500, be advised that if you're in or near retirement, you are indeed at risk. I will grant them that you have a potential problem, even taking out only 4%. But if you have a very clever portfolio that's well designed, taking out 5%, even with adding inflation, which most people don't do, you can do that in perpetuity, even with an example like this starting at the worst time period to start, the year 2000. So hopefully you enjoyed some of the math behind dollar cost ravaging.
Behold the atheist's nightmare. Now, if you study a well-made banana, you'll find on the far side there are 3 ridges. On the close side, 2 ridges. If you get your hand ready to grip a banana, you'll find on the far side there are 3 grooves, on the close side 2 grooves. The banana and the hand are perfectly made one for the other. You'll find the maker of the banana, Almighty God, has made it with a non-slip surface. It has outward indicators of inward contents: green, too early; yellow, just right; black, too late. Now, if you go to the top of the banana, you'll find, as with the soda can makers, they placed a tab at the top. So God has placed a tab at the top. When you pull the tab, the contents don't squirt in your face. You'll find the wrapper, which is biodegradable, has perforations. Notice how gracefully it sits over the human hand. Notice it has a point at the top for ease of entry. It's just the right shape for the human mouth. It's chewy, easy to digest, and it's even curved toward the face to make the whole process so much easier.
The Phil Ferguson Show is for educational purposes only. Nothing said on the show should be interpreted as personalized investment advice. Your investments should be based on your situation, and you should consult with your financial advisor before taking any action. The show may contain ads. These ads are placed into the show by the hosting company after I finish recording and editing. I have little control over the content of the ads, and you should not assume that I support their products or claims. If you choose to support the show via the new Patreon page, that support does not create an advisor-client relationship.
You're listening to The Phil Ferguson Show.
I'm not sure if this really is an investing skeptically segment, but maybe it really is a church money segment. From time to time, I discuss specific church-related issues, monies, spendings, budgets. And of course, if you happen to find yourself in a church for some reason, you had to go to a church to vote, which shouldn't happen, but it does. If you go to a church for a wedding or a funeral, if you go because a friend asks you, I want you to look around at the tables in the hallways, in the lobby, and see if the church has put out a budget. And I've even had a couple of times where someone who's in a church sends me a budget secretly and tells me I can't mention their name, but I'll go over the budget and we'll take a look at where the church is spending the money. And of course, church has a lot of expenses: the building, the roof, the furnace, the lawn maintenance, all these things. And the end result is often that most churches, at least the ones I've looked at, and if you are in a church that does really, really wonderfully at this, send me your budget. But most churches spend a very, very small amount on actually helping the public, helping the community, Often they'll have things like fellowship and outreach, which is just simply trying to spread their religion, not really doing things. So by the time the money gets to buying some soup or providing a warm place for some people during the winter or some shoes or coats, it ends up being just a couple of percentages of all the money brought in, which kind of is the way it's gonna have to be, because you have a big building that you're paying to heat, air condition, water, keep it up to date with construction and repairs, that is only used primarily on Sunday. Now, I know some churches have meetings more and more times of the week, but a lot of the time, those buildings sit mostly empty and aren't being used. So that can be very, very expensive. But now I'm thinking about specifically the Mormon church whistleblower. And I just had the pleasure the other evening of trying to explain to a Trump supporter what a whistleblower actually is and how their identity doesn't matter. They called out an issue, it's been investigated, and it's been found to be factually true. So it doesn't really matter who the whistleblower is. The example I've heard before, and I gave them, is that if I see an active crime going on in the house across the street where the husband is currently beating the wife, and I call the police, and the police come and they find the husband in the process of beating his wife, it doesn't matter who I am. It doesn't matter if I already disliked the guy. I reported something, it was checked and verified and found to be that there was an active crime going on. Anyway, I diverge. There's a new whistleblower in reference to the Mormon Church. And the Mormon Church apparently has at least $100 billion stockpiled. And this is from one company. And I don't think this is the only one that the Mormon Church has. Because from my experience, organizations like this often find multiple places to start stocking away money. That they have this investment company here, and I'm looking for the name, and it'll come to me in a moment. Ensign Peak Advisors, EPA, like the government thing. Ensign Peak Advisors. And apparently they started with $10 billion 22 years ago. And whenever the church can, they add a couple $100 million or a couple of billion year after year after year. And this company invests the money. And now they have at least $100 billion. And this investment company pays no taxes, pays zero taxes to the government on all the profits that they make without being in any kind of IRA or magical accounts. They're just not paying taxes because they are claiming to be affiliated with the Mormon Church. And so this whistleblower released hundreds of pages of documents showing that is their relationship, showing that they're not paying taxes, and even showing how much they have in investments and that they are dodging the tax rules. Well, one of the neat things when you report someone who's not paying their taxes, there's also another rule, and I don't know the details of it, but you can get a cut of the taxes that the IRS collects if they are able to go back and collect taxes. So this person, by filing this whistleblower complaint, could possibly remain anonymous to the public, but could also reap a huge reward if the IRS decides that this church, the Mormon Church, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and or its affiliated investment company, maybe even companies, have to eventually pay their tax bills. And it brings up another thought that I'm just going to tag on here, that if you don't know it, churches are considered charities. And we talked about at the very beginning, they don't really do much, but they're still charities like 501c3s. But as long as they say they're a church, they don't have to file the 501c3 paperwork. And my demand, maybe churches should pay taxes. I'm willing to have that discussion, and I would probably lean towards the fact that they should. But short of them paying taxes, they must be obligated to fill out that annual paperwork that shows where the money came from and where it went. And when that becomes publicly available and able to see by the people who are donating the money, I think it makes a big difference. It really dramatically reduces the ability for fraud and money laundering, and it will really make it clear to people in the church how little money actually goes to doing anything of value, the values that they claim to have, the values that they will tell you that Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount talked about feeding the hungry and taking care of the poor. They don't. At least not in a meaningful way when people lie in the streets and their heated building stays empty in the winter. So anyway, that's a little bit about the Mormon whistleblower.
How you can justify wanting to take something away from people from 95 that gives meaning to 95% of the American people and replace it with something that gives meaning to just 5% of the American people?
Well, what an incredibly stupid question. First, I've said repeatedly that this stuff cannot be taken away from people. It is their favorite toy, and it will remain so. As Freud said in The Future of an Illusion, it will remain that way as long as we're afraid of death and have no problem, which is, I think, likely to be quite a long time. Second, I hope I've made it clear that I'm perfectly happy for people to have these toys and to play with them at home and hug them to themselves and so on and share them with other people who come around and play with the toys. So that's absolutely fine. They are not to make me play with these toys. Okay? I will not play with the toys. Don't bring the toys to my house. Don't say my children must play with these toys. Don't say my toys might be a condom. Here we go again. Are not allowed by their toys. I'm not going to have any of that. Enough with clerical and religious bullying and intimidation. Is that finally clear? Have I got that across? Thank you.
All right, I told you that we were going to talk about Darwin and Darwin's apostles, and we're going to do that. And I have with me one of the two authors of a new book called Darwin's Apostles, and with me is David Orenstein. How are you, sir?
I'm great, Phil. Thanks for inviting me on your show today.
My pleasure. I have this book right in front of me, and mine's a special review copy, and I thank you and the staff, whoever sent me the copy. I guess it was Sarah. Sarah sent me a copy.
From Humanist Press.
Yeah, this is good stuff, man. The only problem I have is I really wish it was an audiobook.
You know, we've heard that from several people, like when is it coming out on audio, when is it coming out on Kindle, and we've reached out to Humanist Press to see, you know, how we can make sure that this happens, because we want the book to be part of, you know, a much wider conversation. And not everybody has the time to sit down and read a 300-page book. But if you could, you know, just listen to it,
yeah,
it makes a lot of sense.
Well,
so, yeah.
I tell people all the time that I don't have time for reading something like this, but honestly, it's more of a personal problem where I just don't have the attention span to sit with a book. And that's always been the case, even in high school. I had the hardest time reading a book. And, of course, today's media, unfortunately, gets us more and more habitualized to 30-second sound bites. But this is a book that...
Oh, it's much more visual media. You know,
yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But this is something...
I mean, there are some great videos which tell Darwin's story in 5 minutes or less, which you can find on YouTube. I mean, what they might lack in a little bit of depth, they make up in making Darwin's story really intriguing as well. So
I like it.
You know, it's how people communicate. You know.
Well, the nice thing about this book is that it talks about Darwin. Of course, it's a story around him and his life, but the
right.
people that were there to help him promote reality, science,
mm-hmm.
and evidence after he published his book. So before we get into that, I want to just mention your other book, Godless Grace, How Non-Believers
right.
Are Making the World Safer, Richer, and Kinder. Spend a couple of minutes telling us about that book, and maybe we can get some people to buy copies for you.
Oh, wow. Okay, sure. This book came out in 2015, and it sort of harkens back to the idea of what Christopher Hitchens said, which is that, it's very clear that non-believers can do quite the same number, if not better, things than people who are believers. Not that there aren't believers who also do wonderful things in the name of humanity, but, non-believers tend to do it without the need for dogma or theology in order to be the reason for their purpose. And so I set out, I'm an anthropologist, so I set out to write this ethnography about people who are doing wonderful things to help the planet, both in terms of the environment as well as helping other people, and doing it for the cause of, the limited time that we have on the planet, making the world a better place, doing no harm, trying to leave an indelible mark that says that we can be better than maybe our current situation if we all just work together for the sake of our humanness, rather than, I'm this, group or this religion or something like that. And as in all ethnographies, they include a lot of interviews with people who are around the world and on every continent working for social justice, climate justice, human rights, civil rights, secular rights, so on and so forth. We also have a section of the book on former clergy who have become atheists and what they do with their time now. And also we devote a large section of the book, about a third of the book, speaking to people who are coming up, that is the Gen Xers or later, and how the 20-somethings and the 30-somethings are less religious. They might be spiritual, but less religious, and what that means in terms of their activism as well. And just recently there was an article posted, I think it was based on Pew Research, validating the fact that most people who are in, post to the year 2000 generation, so many of them are growing up without faith. Even if you look at statistical research centers like the Barna Group, or the Vatican's own research service, lays out the fact that certainly in America, but around the world, religious faith life is shrinking, and we see that in the way people, especially young people, are acting. That is, that they can be good without God, which is the essential purpose of the book, is to say, yes, we can be good. In fact, in some cases, we might even be better without belief in theology.
I just recently was reviewing some of that Pew information, ironically, that you mentioned, and they're talking about how, when it's 5 or 10% of people are of a different religion or non-religious, usually they can easily be set aside and the children get brought up in the religion. But when you get to a point where 30 or 40% of parents, which means if a child has the fortune, generally, of having two parents, one of them is different than the other person, maybe just two different religions, and maybe one of them is non-religious, and that opens the doors for the child to go, well, which one is right and why? And that changes everything. And my kids who are now in their early 20s and even younger now, college students, I have experienced that. We're probably pushing 50% or more who are just not into a formalized religion of any kind. And that's great as long as they grow up being, skeptical, rational, and not just swallowing down crystal crap or something.
Right. And not only being skeptical, but also, having some, the case is always, well, you need religion to be moral. And the reality is you don't need religion to be moral. So you still need an ethical code. I think you find that very clearly in, let's say, the Humanist Manifesto or the UN Declaration of Human Rights. It's laid out. There's no God reference. There's nothing related to anything other than the material universe and how we're all important to each other and equally so.
Excellent. Well, of course, the newest book, which came out just a few weeks ago, and my intention was to be closer to the publishing date, but I kept delaying, fantasizing I was going to make myself read the book, and I have to admit, almost always I tell people I pay people to read books to me via the audiobooks, but I have skimmed it a little bit. I know the story a little bit, but nowhere near as much as, of course, what's in this book. And you also had help from Abby Hafer.
My co-author, yes, Abby Hafer was wonderful.
Yep.
She's a biologist, trained in London, and she's a fantastic friend and a wonderful co-author.
And one of the fun things for me to ask is, who are you, and what is your rationale for having the skills and or background to write a book such as this?
Well, thanks for asking. I'm asked all the time, well, who do you think you are?
Hopefully I said nicer than that. But
I'll put it into the context. I'm a full professor, a tenured professor of anthropology at within City University of New York. I teach anthropology full-time, mainly to undergraduates. I also take them very frequently to Ecuador, and we go to the Galapagos Islands, and we do work on biodiversity and saving the planet. And, I'm as much anthropology for me is as much a career as it is a point of view, which is very aligned with the idea of what the scientific method is and the scientific point of view. And to me, that means respect for all living things and to see how we're all ultimately connected. And I try to bring that out in my classes for students who are very urban and don't really maybe understand the mechanics of natural selection or the mechanics of how nature works, and showing our connectivity. And it's always fun to work with undergraduates. But yeah, so my background is originally in primate behavior, primatology. And then I've been both an academic administrator, but for the last 7.5 years, I've been teaching anthropology and loving every moment of it. It's the type of job where if I had to do it for free, I probably would, but fortunately, CUNY pays me. So
yeah, it is a rare thing, and I'm one of those very, very lucky people that something that I would do for fun, helping people with investments. I think it's the greatest thing ever, but people pay me for it, and it's really cool.
Yeah. I tell my students all the time, if you can get a job when you get your paycheck and you say, "Oh my goodness, you're paying me to do this," you've found your life's work.
I like it. Now, let me segue brutally over to Darwin.
Okay.
When he was a younger man, at least his father, I think, didn't someone want him to be a priest? Is that? Or is it a
Darwin's
consideration?
Father was a physician, so Darwin was not part of the aristocracy, but he did come from wealth.
Yeah.
Darwin started his academic career at a very young age, as most people who were wealthy in England, in Victorian England, did. He started out as a physician, and then to become a doctor. Then didn't feel comfortable in that field, and it's sort of something I think we can all relate to, that our parents want us to be X, Y, and Z, but that's not really in our nature to be this. And I can relate to that because I started out as an accounting major.
Yeah.
And within 2 weeks realized this wasn't me. Darwin, I think, faced that same thing. So Darwin actually graduated with a degree in theology.
Maybe that's what I was thinking of.
When he graduated. But he never practiced. And really, when you think about Victorian England in the 19th century, if you were a part of the aristocracy, or if you were wealthy, you either became a doctor, a lawyer, or a clergy person, because those were the three areas that were the most powerful in that time period.
Fair enough. And of course, at some point, he ends up on a boat.
Yeah, the HMS Beagle, because, even as someone who was studying theology, I think his whole life is such an interesting life. He was really a naturalist and had this incredible curiosity and inquisitiveness that his academic studies clearly could not satisfy. The 19th century was a period of real adventure. So was the late 18th century as well. And so Darwin was definitely taken aback by, or affront, if you will, by the idea of seeing the world and investigating the world. And he was very fortunate to have been selected and have gotten the support of those around him to, at a very early age, to become the ship's naturalist on the HMS Beagle.
And of course, to me, again, we were talking about this 30-second entertainment cycle, but
right.
How long was he on the boat?
5 years.
And that was known before he got on the boat, right? I mean, it's like, oh, I'm just going to go take this boat trip for 5 freaking years. And of course, the other thing is, not only did he have the curiosity to look into and think about these things, but his meticulous notes and specimens and organization skills. I mean, this was a really unusual combination of skill sets, and being able to sit on a boat for 5 years. I can't imagine doing that in this modern world.
The 19th century was a period of real exploration, of European exploration, and also came with a lot of other things like European imperialism. But for the people who were naturalists, like, let's say, Darwin or one of the apostles, Joseph Hooker, or the other, T.H. Huxley, who also had individual really grandiose long-term voyages around the world to explore and explain it and meet cultures and bring back evidence and species and stuff like that. This is really a real grand time to readjust the lens of how we interpret the world, and these naturalists in particular really did an incredible job of doing that. And Darwin, we always think about Darwin on the Galapagos Islands, but he was only in the Galapagos for, I think it was 3 weeks, maybe.
Yeah, I think it was 19 days, maybe in the book. Yeah,
and of that. Oh, I'm sorry?
I was thinking it was 19 days or something like that. But
yeah, 19 days.
And half the time was on the boat.
Days. Yeah, and only about 5 were spent on land. I mean, he had people bringing him back things. But when you think about the significant biodiversity of the Galapagos Islands and, the idea of moving from the idea, when Darwin, I think, left on the boat, he was a transmutationist, if you will, because there was no idea of evolution in the sense of what Darwin would later postulate, or Wallace for that matter. Wallace also, we can't forget, is the co-discoverer or uncoverer of natural selection, and he himself was a Britishman who spent years in the Amazon rainforest and was he was 10 years younger than Darwin, but was certainly a contemporary of him, and in a way a catalyst for the publication of Origin of Species as well.
Yeah, because if I recall the story correctly, Darwin was writing his book for a very long period of time, and maybe
almost 2 decades.
Yeah, and maybe a little bit concerned about how its publication might affect his family life, the religion of people around him, and he just wanted to make double, triple, quadruple sure. And then he gets a letter from Wallace that says, "Hey, what do you? I was thinking about publishing on this subject. What do you think?"
Right.
And just, to have that moment where you're like, "Oh my God, 2 decades I've been working on this, and this guy's going to scoop me because I'm, dragging my feet."
Yeah, I mean, this was the thing about Darwin. Darwin, I think, suffered his whole life from levels of anxiety, and they only became more difficult, certainly after his daughter Annie died in, I think, 1851. But as he got closer and closer to publication, the intensity to not publish as his findings became clearer and clearer was a reality. And then Darwin, I think it was 1858, gets this 20-page letter from Wallace outlining essentially in 20 pages what Darwin was writing in several hundred of natural selection. In fact, he even wrote, I think it was to Huxley or Hooker, this guy has basically, as you say, schooled me. He said something like, I've labored for 20 years writing this book, and here's my book written in 20 pages.
Yeah.
And again, that was certainly one of the catalysts. In fact, it was both Hooker and Huxley who, in 1858, presented both Darwin and Wallace together and their theory of natural selection to the Royal Society, which was the first coming out party, if you will, for the idea of this idea of adaptation, speciation. And it was so profound. And I think one of the reasons why Darwin was so fearful of publishing was simply because of what Huxley would say very crystalline, which was that essentially Darwin, through his work, had killed God.
Yeah, and it's an amazing thing. And for listeners, if you have not read Origin of the Species, it is surprisingly, I don't know, it almost feels like it was written a few years ago. It is very clear. It is very organized. It flows. It's not a labor, and it lays out the story very, very well. And of course, through modern technology and 150, 160, 170 years of research and data, we know a lot more. But the kernel of it, the basic facts in it, are still generally correct. That's pretty staggering.
Could you imagine writing a book 150 years before the scanning electron microscope, before the idea of
DNA,
of understanding DNA?
Yeah.
I mean, essentially, Darwin unlocked the mechanism of how life on Earth occurred without any, just the superficial observation, none of the understanding of the biology. I mean, it is, of course, an understanding of biology, but, Theodore Dobrinsky said in 1977, I think it was, nothing in biology makes sense without the light of evolution, without the light of natural selection. And here's Darwin, after 20 years of laboring and researching and, writing, and, the Darwin archives is so immense, for someone who was in the public eye, but not entirely, because he had incredible correspondence with people from around the globe. So Darwin was a pivot point as both a researcher, as an intellectual, for many, many people. But he unlocked nature without the things that we take for granted, like understanding DNA and the idea of even mitochondrial DNA or gene flow or any of these things. He did it all, and did it in such a superb way that you're right. When he wrote Origin of Species in 1859, by the way, our book was published on the 160th anniversary of the original publication of the Origin of Species.
Nice.
November 24th, 1859. So we deliberately timed it for that. But here's this man who, for all of his foibles, for all of his inabilities to communicate in mass publicly as an orator, he was able to do privately, and then writing this book. And when we wrote this book, I started to write this book. Abby came on as my co-author about a year into it because I wanted another voice to make the book stronger, and she does have such a clear and beautiful writing voice. Darwin, for me, is like the Beatles song, I get by with a little help from my friends.
Yeah.
Because it really was the apostles who, formed this village around him. Because there were so many people who couldn't wait to see Darwin fail or wanted to see Darwin fail, whether it be the aristocracy, because the implications of natural selection is if we're all equal, why do we need an aristocracy? Or the theocracy of the time, the Church of England, wanted to see Darwin fail and belittled his work because it meant, as like I said, Huxley said, Darwin essentially took the divine out of our species, especially.
Yeah.
So the original work and Darwin's later work, especially The Descent of Man, are both such humbling works in that they do what the late great Carl Sagan did. And yesterday, at the December 20th, was the anniversary of the sad passing of Carl Sagan. Was that he was able to write in such a way to make the work clear, to make this was not written like a theorem where you would need great, years of math to understand. It's like, here's the answer. I'm laying it out for you. This is the mechanics of the natural biological world. It doesn't need the divine. It works over long periods of time. Yeah, later on we understand that there's ideas like punctuated equilibrium and that, sometimes climactic things happen which changes the biosphere. But for the most part, adaptation, speciation, extinction over long periods of time is the way of thing, whether we're an amoeba, whether we're talking about primates, whether we're talking about really any aspect of the aquasphere, the biosphere, the atmosphere, and the universe. I mean, the thing about Darwin's work is that my assumption is that, like in all good science, that the mechanics of it work whether you're on Earth or whether you're in Alpha Centauri somewhere, because science, as a very popular atheist bumper sticker likes to say, science works whether you believe it or not.
Absolutely. Now you have listed here, I think it's 5 apostles.
Right.
And can you wrap up their names here and tell us what they did to help Darwin?
Sure. So I talked a little bit about Huxley.
Yep.
Huxley was a very, very, unlike Darwin, did not come from a pedigreed life. His father was, I believe, a preacher. They had not a lot of money. He went in to become a physician, but he was a radical his whole life. He is the progenitor of both Aldous Huxley. Any Huxley that you read is related to T.H. Huxley. So he served in the Navy, and he was I believe the best way to characterize T.H. Huxley was to say he was the 19th century version of Christopher Hitchens.
Very nice.
He didn't stand well for people's bullshit, and made it clear that way. He was also one of these people who not only entrusted was enthralled by Darwin's work, but he was also a labor activist. And so when you have someone who's not born with a silver spoon in their mouth and they come up and they make it, sometimes people sort of forget who they were when they were young or poor. Huxley never did that. He was someone who fought for workers' rights, women's rights, abolition. He really was a 21st century man living in the 19th century.
Absolutely.
In the most liberal sense of the word.
And after the book came out, of course, there's all these battles, and did it kind of just settle in to be accepted in 10 or 20 years, or was there never really a time like that?
I'm sorry. Can you say that again?
Yeah, sure. Did Darwin's work get accepted in general by the scientific or the masses in 5 or 10 years, or has that never really happened to this day?
Well, we talk about this in the book. The Origin of the Species, when it was published in 1859, sold out its first edition in one day. So there was great interest across the scientific community, across the social community, all across Europe and the United States. But the same issues related to not accepting natural selection, whether it be in the modern sense of the idea of intelligent design or creationism, which the excuses for those things haven't changed since, or the arguments for them haven't changed since 1859. They're just spoken by different people. But there was a tremendous amount of acceptance. I mean, the fear, of course, was that those who were in high positions, both in the intelligentsia, like, for instance, Robert Owen was not a big fan of Darwin's work, and he was the head of the British Museum. So he had a lot of power, and as a transmutationalist or whatever, even though he's a fine naturalist, really had knives out for Darwin. And so then, as today, 160 years later, after we go through the United States, the Scopes monkey trial,
right? Or
in 50 years later, we have Kitzmiller versus the Dover, PA school board. The issue is, and they become tiring in that, the objections to Darwin's work in natural selection remain the same. And then you have to be very careful, because even, you had Rick Santorum put in what was called the Santorum Amendment, which essentially, when George Bush was penning the legislation for No Child Left Behind, the Santorum Amendment basically said, teach the controversy, meaning which there is no controversy, but the idea of, well, there are other ways of looking at the world, and so shouldn't we just on an equal footing put intelligent design up there with natural selection?
Yeah.
Fortunately, for history's sake, that amendment never made it into the final legislation. But you have the Discovery Institute, which pushes the idea of, under the idea of rational science, the idea of pushing the controversy. You have people like Michael Behe writing books about, the idea that Darwin got it wrong. Well, Darwin didn't get everything right, but 160 years later, we know that 90% of it he did.
Yeah, he did really well, and it's still today we have these battles, and it's truly amazing. So, what can the listener do? Of course, other than reading Darwin's Apostles and Origin of the Species and The Descent of Man, how can they get involved today and try to help the battle? How can they become apostles?
Well, let me just finish up with a couple of the other apostles,
yes,
if you don't mind.
It's all good.
There was Joseph Hooker, who was Darwin's closest friend and advocate, one of the persons who read Darwin's work before and edited their work before they were published. There was Asa Gray, who was an American, who, again, these are the apostles in the book, who was a naturalist and deeply religious, by the way, but he saw no conflict between Darwin's work and his personal idea of what the divine would create. In fact, it was Asa Gray who was the equivalent of copyright for Darwin for The Origin of the Species when it was published in the United States. Then, as today, there's a lot of counterfeit media out there, And so when Darwin published The Origin of Species, it was republished in the United States unofficially in several different places. And what Asa Gray helped to do, amongst being a tremendous advocate of Darwin's work in general, was to make sure that all those unofficial books didn't necessarily see the light of day, and also got royalties for Charles Darwin, so that his work, as he had written it, was officially published in the United States. Let me see. Oh, and there's also John William Draper. During the great 1860 debate, which was known in modern times as the Huxley-Wilberforce debate, which was which was after Origin of Species came out, there were actually three of the apostles actually spoke in defense of Darwin at that debate. It was T.H. Huxley, it was Joseph Hooker, and it was John William Draper. Draper is an interesting guy because he was British and he moved to the United States. He was eventually the first president of the Chemical Society. He was a scientist. He helped found New York University Medical Center, and was a real, very interesting guy. He wrote this incredible book about the conflict between religion and science, and so these are essentially the five people who we've selected. There were a lot of people in Darwin's life who were advocates for him, and in fact, we talk about that in one of the chapters of the books. And we also want to make sure that your listeners understand that even though the book is subtitled "The Men Who Fought to Have Evolution Accepted," that there were also women who were involved as well, including Darwin's wife. Emma Darwin was a deeply religious woman and feared for the separation of their souls after their deaths because of what Darwin wrote. Yet she was a tremendous advocate for Darwin and his work, and was an editor of all of his works. Darwin's daughter would later publish his official biography. Even as Darwin was a young man, as a student, one of his female cousins, who would be considered the equivalent of a 19th century wild child, had a huge impact on Darwin as well. So, we focus on these five people, but clearly there were other people who were involved in Darwin's life. Lyell, the geologist, had a significant impact. In fact, Darwin, when he was on the voyage of the Beagle, had Lyell's work on geology with him for the 5 years of the journey. But getting back to your original question, what can we do now? Well, there are a lot of things we can do now. I think if you even have a tepid understanding of the importance of a rationalist view of the world based on the mechanics of nature, that you accept natural selection as a given. That doesn't mean that you can't be speculative or you can't have questions about it, but that, if you want to be an advocate for Darwin, speak about the importance of things like evolution. Darwin not only wrote this work before the scanning electron microscope and before modern biology came into existence, but he came in before we understood the DNA relevance of our connectivity as a species and how it's related all the way back 300,000 years to Africa, mapping the mitochondrial DNA in our bodies. He wrote this book before the tremendous fossil evidence was found indicating that we have an African ancestry going back, several million years into the fossil record. So if you understand biology even from the most mild sense of the understanding of it, you understand, as I think I mentioned before, that you can't have biology, you can't have chemistry, you can't have AI even. You know, when you think about what Darwin has affected through natural selection, it wasn't just biology. It's the social sciences, it's the behavioral sciences, it's the physical sciences. Natural selection has implications outside of biology and into every aspect of the world in which we live in. Linguistics can't be ignored as well because, you know, things either adapt, they speciate, or they become extinct.
Yeah.
And that's culture. That happens with culture. That happens with language, and that happens in biology.
And religion.
Yes, exactly.
Absolutely. Now, I'm assuming you are available to give talks. If someone's running a conference, how can they reach you and invite you to come present?
Oh man, you can't shut me up. It's because I like the work that I do.
And I'm also guessing you're used to 50-minute monologues in front of the class.
Exactly. But, you know, I can be reached certainly through the Humanist Press. I have my own website, which is davidorenstein.net, I think it is. I can't remember. You can reach me through that. You can reach me on Facebook, on Twitter. If you want to reach me by email, it's davidorenstein@gmail.com. If you leave out the I, you send it to David Orenstein, who doesn't like me very much and lives in Israel. So don't forget to write David I. Orenstein @gmail.com. And I am, I'm very fortunate in that, since the book has come out and there's been a lot of interest in having me speak. So I'm happy to come out. Like T.H. Huxley, was not born with a silver spoon in my mouth, so I don't consider myself a celebrity, which means I'm not asking for first-class tickets anywhere. I'm not asking for premium accommodations. I'm not even asking for honorariums. For me, it's more about being part of the bigger conversation. So, and it doesn't necessarily have to be like-minded conversation, you know.
Yeah.
Although I make it a point not to be a person who wants necessarily debate like Ken Ham and Bill Nye did a few years ago. You know, what's better, religion or science, or I'm not that type of debater. But if you want to talk about the history of science, if you want to talk about Darwin's work, if you want to talk about my own ideas as a humanist, I am humanist clergy. I believe in the most widest definition of the spiritual world and wonder, which is non-divine, but looking up at the sky and being enthralled by it. I'm also a humanist activist for the American Humanist Association. I serve as their a delegate to the United Nations. I also serve at the Smithsonian Institute for their Hall of Human Origins. I'm on their board of directors, so there's a lot of ways to get a hold of me. I'm what you would consider a public intellectual, but if you were to look at my bank account, you wouldn't know it.
Well, I think that goes with being a public intellectual.
Yeah,
but
which means that I should really talk to you offline about how to develop my resources so I can retire at a decent age as well.
Absolutely. Be happy to talk about that. Everybody, the first book is Godless Grace. He was co-author of that. The new one, brand new, Darwin's Apostles. Again, David Orenstein, thank you so much for coming on the Phil Ferguson Show. I appreciate your time very much.
Phil, it's been a pleasure, and thank you, and I thank your audience, and happy holidays.
You're You're listening to The Bill Ferguson Show.
Once again, I would like to thank you very much for being here, very much for listening to the show and telling all of your friends about it. I have so many emails that come in where someone said a friend recommended this, or often I'll hear about when I'm on another show. It brings in some new listeners. So thank you all for being part of the program. I greatly appreciate it. If you like the show, if you find value in the show, there's a couple of things you can do to help me out in a very small way. One is go to Patreon, patreon.com/Phil, and donate a couple of dollars. I do it per show, so if I go somewhere or I don't put out shows for a few weeks, it doesn't cost you a dime. You only pay when I put out new content. In the past, a couple of times, I've done a best of show where I used an interview from years in the past. You also do not pay for those. So the amount of money that actually leaves your pocket is very small. Right now I have the top tier set at $6.66. Just having a little fun there with that number. The other thing you can do, of course, is leave a 5-star review at iTunes, if it still exists when you listen to this, or Apple Podcast, I think is the new thing it's going to be called, or you can correct me on that. You can also leave reviews at Stitcher. And it always helps. I had mentioned a couple shows back that I showed someone the link to my podcast, and they were stunned that there was, I don't know, something like 300, 400 reviews, and almost all of them are 5 stars. And thank you. That immediately tells a prospective new listener that the show is legitimate. I don't know that it means it's good, but I hope it does. But clearly it's not a brand new show, because a brand new show might have your 3 or 4 friends giving you 5-star reviews, and you're very happy to have them. So we're going to continue doing our thing in 2020. I hope you'll be around. If you have questions or want me to look at your portfolio, you, of course, can send me an email. In the first email, do not send anything other than maybe basic information, your name, and please your phone number. I'm a talker. I much prefer to talk and go over the nuance over the telephone. Maybe in a second or third email, you can send me a statement or something. We can talk about it. Quick reminder, I am on a 2-month hold for new employees. I'm in the process of trying to update my systems here, and I'm going to use a software to track all my communications, correspondence, and documents. I think it's Client Resource Manager, something, CRM. I know it's called a CRM, and I'm new to this, so it's going to take some extra time for me after the holidays to get that up to speed. And then I have my eye on a second thing to try to make things more efficient for me, because I'm really close to full. And so I'm going to take these couple of months to try to make my business and my time more efficient. And hopefully that will allow me to take a few more clients in 2020. But we'll see how it goes. If it makes me much more efficient, great. If it only makes me a little efficient, then at some point I may have to go to $1 million minimum. Thank you for listening. I appreciate it very much. And I hope to see you at a conference out there on the road somewhere soon. Until then, ciao.
My goodness. Becky, look at her Bible. It is so huge. She looks like one of those preacher guys' girlfriend. But who understands those preacher guys anyway? They only talk to her because she looks like Mother Teresa, okay? I mean, but look at it. It's just huge. It's gross. She just looks so righteous.
I like big Bibles and I cannot lie. You Christian brothers can't deny that when a girl walks in with a KJV and a bookmark in Proverbs, you get stoked. Got a name engraved so you know this girl is saved. It looks like one of those large ones with plenty of space in the margins. Oh baby, I wanna read with ya, cause your Bible's got pictures. My minister tried to console me, but that book you got makes
me so holy.
Ooh, mama mia, you say you want koinonia? Well, bless me, and teach me about John Wesley. I saw her praying while I was DJing. She got grace, pretty face. She ain't going down to the bad place. I'm tired of heathen guys saying they like pocket size. As the average Christian to take a look, she got a pack much book. So fellas, fellas, have your girlfriends got the book? Oh yeah. Well, read it, read it, read it, read it, read that holy book. Baby got NIV with the ribbon bookmark. NIV with the ribbon bookmark. Baby got NIV with the ribbon bookmark. NIV with the ribbon bookmark. I like 'em leather and bound. It's 50 pounds. I just can't understand how it is some weenie wants Bible on CD. She wanna get you saved. Amen. Double up. Amen. I ain't talking about a paraphrase, cause Paul wouldn't use those anyways. I like 'em real thick and red lettered. You can't find nothing better. Southpaws in love, Bibles that big are unheard of. So I'm sitting here thinking, what if I find me a girl that shows midriff? You can have those bimbos, I keep those chicks that do devos. A word to the Christian sisters, I can't resist ya. I do God's time with ya, but I gotta be straight when I say I wanna pray till the break of day. Baby got it going on, like the wife in Proverbs 31. We just might get engaged when we finish reading this page, cause it's worn and it's torn, and I know that girl's reborn. So ladies, ladies, do you wanna save people from Hades? Then read it till the pages fall out. Even white preachers gotta shout. Baby got Thompson chain with the big red letters. Thompson chain with the big red letters. Baby got book. Yeah, baby. When it comes to a good book, Stephen King's resume just can't compare. 39 plus 27 equals 66 books. And if you're Catholic, there's even more. So your girlfriend quotes Bill Hybels, but does she got a big Bible? Cause that little thing she's got won't start a revival. My Bible study don't want none unless you got book, hun. You can read Clancy or Grisham, but please don't lose this book. Some brothers wanna play that hard role and tell you that book's too old, so they toss it and they burn it. But I pull up quick to just learn it. So your girl likes paperback. Well, I ain't down with that, cause my girlfriend's hot and her Bible's rockin', and she's got good doctrine. To the atheist chicks who try to diss, you ain't it, Miss Priss. Give me a Christian, I'm insisting, and I greet her with some holy kissing. Some pervert tried to chase, but he didn't make it past first base. She's quick to resist temptation, and she loves a new translation. So ladies who are lost and found, if you want the 666 thrown down, dial 1-800-READS-A-LOT and teach me about those Psalms. Baby got NIV with the ribbon bookmark. NIV with the ribbon bookmark. Baby got Thompson chain with the big red letters. Thompson chain with the big red letters. Bible cows knowledge, but you still got book. Bible cows knowledge, but you still got book. Bible cows knowledge, but you still got book. Bible cows knowledge, but you still got